Welcome everybody to this UK Trade Policy Observatory seminar. We're here to talk about developing countries' access after Brexit, and I'm grateful for you giving up your lunch times to join us. My name is Ian Mitchell. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Centre for Global Development, think tank in London and Washington, and we worked with the Trade Policy Observatory and the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, to produce this report. And in a moment, I will introduce in greater detail our speakers at this event, but they will be Mattia Di Baldo, who's a research fellow at the University of Sussex, Mohammed Razak, who's Research Director at the Policy Research Institute, Dakar, and Emily Jones, who directs the Global Economic Governance Programme at the University of Oxford. So what we'll do is we'll start off with Mattia in a moment, who's going to talk about the research that he led. But then I hope we'll get on to talk about both what that means in the real world and what that means for development, and then come on to what it should mean for UK government policy and how the government should respond. But let me just first give you a little bit of the policy background. Some of us have been working on this agenda for a while, and I mean, after the Brexit vote and the decision to leave, I guess the first important milestone in this was the government announcing in June 2017 that they would improve access for the poorest countries post-Brexit. They could elaborate on how they would do so beyond replicating the EU's everything but arms scheme. But we've been waiting to see what the UK's tariffs would look like. And of course, they were confirmed earlier this year in terms of the UK Global Tariff, the UKGT, which is the UK's most favoured nation tariff. We are still waiting to see how many of the EU's existing trade deals the UK will manage to roll over before January. And the final part of this puzzle, of course, is the preferences that the UK offer to lower income countries, where, again, we're waiting for the detail to be confirmed, but we understand at the moment that the plan is to replicate exactly the EU approach. So it seemed that with the UK Global Tariff being a little bit lower than the EU's, that would be squeezing preferences. And so we undertook this piece of work to understand what the exact implications would be. So we'll hear from our speakers first, and then we should have plenty of time for some comments and questions from those of you that tuned in. But let me turn first to Mattia Di Baldo, who's a research fellow at the University of Sussex Business School, a fellow of the UKTPO. You'll see his research focuses on EU trade policy, and he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex, so he's very well qualified to talk to us about this. Mattia, you're happy to kick off with your slides?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ian, for the introduction. Yeah, so let me just dive right in the report and the main findings of this research. So Ian has already given quite a lot of introduction about the background of the policy, so I can just go in and explain what we did. So in the first part of this report, I'll go over the effects that the tariff schedules that developing countries' exports will face in the UK starting next year, how this will affect their trade with the UK, and basically there's going to be the effect of the application of the UK Global Tariff and the replication of the EU GSP scheme. Then in the second part of this brief talk, I will identify some immediate changes that the government could make to improve sort of almost right away market access for developing countries to the UK. And then finally, we're going to try and evaluate the likely market access losses for two of the countries, Kenya and Ghana, which haven't rolled over their economic partnership agreements yet with the UK. And there could be losses in case they were to fall back, say, on the UK GSP in terms of tariffs. Okay, let me start with the assessment of how the tariffs that developing countries will face in the UK will affect their trade. As mentioned, the new UK Global Tariff will apply from January 2021. This is the new most favored nation regime that will apply to all imports from the countries with whom the UK does not have a trade agreement and that are also not part of a preferential scheme. Now, the UKGT is actually quite similar to the UMFN, although its level, as Ian already said, is a bit lower than the UMFN. So the average difference, if you take just the simple mean of the tariff, is about 1 percentage point between the UMFN and the UKGT. If you weight these tariffs by trade, the difference shrinks even more, but the lower level of the UKGT will affect trade of developing countries, both positively and negatively, as you'll see. The next thing the government plans to do is to replicate the EU generalized system of preferences. Now, this is a unilateral preference scheme whereby a donor, and in this case it will be the UK, offers preferential market access to a list of developing countries. Now, there's 3 sub-schemes in the EU GSP scheme at the moment. The standard GSP is the least preferential. These countries benefit from lower than MFN tariffs on about 2/3 of the tariff lines. And GSP Plus is a little bit more preferential because the tariff go all the way down to 0 on about the same products as the standard GSP ones. I would like you to sort of see that the coverage of these 2 schemes, the standard GSP and GSP Plus, is not complete. So there's about 1/3 of the products that would be exported and are not GSP eligible. And then finally, the Everything But Arms initiative is the most preferential schemes available to least developed countries, and they benefit from duty-free access to the EU on all their products except arms. Now, the question is, what will the UK GSP look like? Are there going to be exactly the same tariffs as in the EU GSP, or will the government try to maintain the same difference relative to the, we will know that there's going to be a lower MFN schedule in the UK. So we had to work with one of these 2 scenarios, and we assumed that the UK will set the tariff in its GSP at the same level as they are now in the EU GSP. And so from this working assumption and the sort of combined application of UKGT, we expect there to be 2 sorts of effects for developing countries. On one side, the level of tariffs is going to be lower. At least this will apply to some exports from some GSP beneficiaries. These are the products which are not eligible for GSP, and they will get the benefit of a lower UKGT tariff rate relative to the UMFN one. This is sort of a benefit that is available to standard GSP and GSP Plus members, just because the coverage of these schemes is not complete, as I just mentioned before. Then a negative effect of the UKGT, of the introduction of the UKGT instead, is going to be the reduction in the degree of preferences relative to the competitors that GSP beneficiaries have at the moment. So in other words, the UKGT will squeeze their competitive advantage relative to other trade partners. And this effect is going to be worse for those countries such as the EBA members whose tariffs are already 0. They can only lose from the reduction in the level of the UKGT through what we call preference erosion. To give you a brief example of what we mean by preference erosion, this is an example of an actual tariff rate. So this product has a tariff of 7.5% in the UMFN schedule. It's been set at a lower level. So in UKGT it's 6%, whereas the preferential rate right now in the EU GSP is 4%, and then there's a 0% for EBA members. Now, this structure of tariffs in the EU means that GSP members benefit from a 3.5 percentage points margin relative to the UMFN schedule, whereas EBA members benefit from the entire 7.5 percentage point margin. And this will be shown by the size of these 2 boxes for GSP countries and the entire size of the bar for EBA members. But since the UKGT is going to be lower than the UMFN rate, both GSP and EBA GSP Plus members are going to lose a fraction of this preferential margin, which in this case corresponds to 1.5 percentage points. It will be the size of these light blue boxes over here. So that's what we mean by the worsening of their competitive position. If you're wondering how much these preference margins are going to change, this picture shows you the mean preference margin computed at the sector level, and we plot basically the mean preference margin for each sector under the current EU regime against what the mean preference margin will be in the UK regime starting next year. And so for each of these dots, this is a sector, for instance, you can see that the average margin in the EU is higher than the margin products will actually get in the UK regime. Or put differently, basically being below this 45-degree line is bad news for the competitive position of developing countries when exporting to the UK, relative to what they had until now. Then the next thing we did is we wondered what kind of impact this change in tariffs, basically the switch from the UMFN to the UKGT, will have on trade between the UK and developing countries, and actually all the countries in the world. So for that, we modeled the impact on trade with a stylized model, which is in our report. The main features of this model is just that we group the countries in 6 supplier groups, the 3 sort of GSP sub-schemes. Then we had EPA members separately, EU and FTA partners, and the rest of the world. And we did this calculation by 7 tariff bands to see where the effects are strongest. Now, this table just shows you a very quick summary of our findings. You can see the changes in trade in absolute terms are shown in the 3rd column over here, where you can see that the effect of the introduction of the UKGT is, perhaps unsurprisingly, that UK imports will increase because import prices are lower, but this extra trade is going to be coming from almost entirely the rest of the world countries. They're going to have an increase in trade by about 1.9 billion dollars in this case. We measure this in dollars with the UK. There's going to be we modeled some increase in trade for GSP members, 30 million extra UK imports from these countries. That this is only due to the fact that GSP members trade some of this trade is in non-GSP eligible products, and in these products they get an advantage from the lower UKGT rates. Every other group of country, as you can see from the table, will lose out through preference erosion, although it must be said that the losses are not very large. And this is especially, like you can see for EBA, the losses are about $3 million, or relative to the amount that they already shipped to the UK, it's less than 0.1%. So what this means is that the UKGT probably didn't go far below the UMFN, precisely in those products which are really important for EBA countries or GSP plus countries, and this is kind of good news. However, the main message coming out of this table is that under the current plan, there's not going to be an improvement in market access for developing countries post-Brexit. So there's something else the government needs to do to maintain this promise. So to give a sort of a couple of hints about what could be done to improve market access, we thought of a couple of scenarios. One is there could be lower tariff on textiles, for instance, because there's a lot of tariff charged on imports in textiles. The current preferential margin in the EU GSP is not very generous on these products. The margin is about 1.6 percentage points. Here you can see for textile, and 2.4 percentage points for clothing. Now, as per EU regulation, even wanting to stay within the realm of the regulation of the EU GSP, the margin could be increased to 3.5 percentage points below the UMFN schedule. This is really just coming out of EU regulation. So we thought, what if the government were to do that? How would UK imports in textiles change in case the margin were to be increased to 3.5 percentage points? Now, this will clearly favor those countries, the standard GSP ones, who export to the UK and pay tariff on textiles. But at the same time, you might worry about the position of EBA members. These countries are competitors of the GSP ones in textile production, and their margin is going to be squeezed by the increase in this preference margin. You can see this from this picture. This is the situation at the moment where a certain product benefits from a margin of a certain amount here relative to the MFN schedule. The GSP countries get this kind of preference margin, and relative to that, to the GSP countries, EBA countries benefit from a margin of this amount, whereas under sort of a larger preference margin scenario given to GSP countries, EBA's margin relative to the GSP ones would be reduced, as you can see over here. Now, the overall impact on trade, though, from imposing this change in preference margin would sort of be positive. If you look at these figures, we model this change in tariffs to lead to extra 40 million UK imports from GSP countries and 5 million less imports from EBA and GSP plus countries. And this sort of small losses for the EBA members is likely, again, due to the fact that changing this margin will affect products in tariff bands where there's very few EBA supplies. The second scenario that we thought of, which will probably be even more ambitious, is that, well, the government could try and give a larger margin to GSP countries and at the same time avoiding completely erosion of preference for EBA countries. And this could be done if the margins were increased in products or sectors where EBA members trade relatively very little. So staring a little bit at the data, we kind of maybe surprisingly found that there's a lot of products where EBA countries don't trade with the UK. So out of the 5,300 and something different products that the UK imported from all types of GSP members, over 3,000 products were imported from GSP and GSP Plus countries, but not by EBA members. And out of these 3,000, over 1,000 of these products face actually positive tariffs. So these tariffs could be the object of an intervention in case the margins wanted to be sort of increased for GSP countries. And by doing that, there will be almost no harm to EBA members because they don't trade in these products so far. And if you wonder where these products are sort of in the sort of sector spectrum, we computed the share of UK imports in sort of from GSP countries that are not traded by EBA members, and out of the total imported by GSP countries, this share is 90% in chemicals or 82% in wood and wood charcoal. So there are sectors where EBA countries trade so little with UK that it would be sensible to think of increasing preference margins for GSP countries. Finally, a few words on the situation of Ghana and Kenya. These two countries, as Ian mentioned, are yet to roll over their EPA agreement with the UK. So far, they trade with the UK, so they can export duty-free to UK. Ghana benefits from the EPA. Kenya benefits from a market access regulation arrangement. But both these countries are at risk of facing tariffs next year in case they fail to roll over their arrangements, because the most likely scenario is that they would fall back on the UK GSP scheme. So we looked at the situation for these two countries. For Ghana in particular, this is the situation. So the headline is that there's not going to be huge losses if Ghana were to fall onto the UK GSP rate, because most of the exports from Ghana do not attract high tariffs in general. But there are a few sectors which are going to bear the bulk of the losses in terms of market access. And these sectors are preparation of meat and fish, vegetable and fruit. If you look at this table, they would face an average tariff of 20% in the UK GSP, or about 7% for vegetables and fruit. And or for instance, if you want to look at the other part of the table, here we compute the duties that Ghana would save by signing an FTA relative to paying UKGT tariffs, or what they would save by applying for GSP Plus or falling back on the GSP. So overall, there will be about £13 million worth of duty saved if Ghana rolled over its FTA with the UK. But look at where these tariffs come from. They come almost exclusively out of these two sectors. And these two sectors are also highly dependent on the UK as an export market. So even if the losses overall are not very large, you might want to pay attention to producers, for instance, of tuna in Ghana or banana plantations, which are going to face quite a high tariff in the UK. A very similar situation applies to Kenya. Kenya is also not going to face huge losses in terms of market access if it were to fall onto the UK GSP. The table structure is the same as we just saw for Ghana. So this 12 million over here represents the amount of tariffs that Ghana would save if it were to roll over the FTA with UK instead of paying UKGT tariffs. But again, similarly to Ghana, most of these tariffs come out of a couple of sectors: vegetable and fruit, live plants, and floricultural products. So we're talking about cut flowers, beans, and tea. These sectors are, again, also highly dependent on the UK as an export market and would face quite high tariffs. So even if Ghana as a country overall is not going to be losing a lot out of the failed rollover, these industries need to be looked after. Concluding, this report tried to show that the introduction of the UKGT and the replication of the GSP scheme alone will not allow to improve market access for developing countries to the UK. There are some gains for some countries, especially standard GSP ones, but only coming from the fact that they trade in non-GSP eligible products. We propose a couple of interventions that could actually improve market access for developing countries post-Brexit if the government wanted to do so. And in terms of market access losses due to failed rollovers, we saw there's not large losses, but losses are concentrated in specific industries, and these need to be looked after in case the rollovers do not happen. So I would stop here. Thank you.
Excellent, Mattia. Thank you very much for getting across a very complicated model and detailed analysis in such a concise way. We should say thank you to our co-authors, Alan Winters, Max Mendez Parra, who wrote sections on Ghana and Kenya, which I'd encourage you to look at, and Lee Robinson from CGD, who was responsible for some of the very nice charts in that presentation. So thank you to those guys. So let me move straight on to our first discussant. So we're really pleased that we've got Mohammed Razak with us. He is the director, the research director at the Policy Research Institute in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Not only has he got a PhD from Sussex University, but until recently he was also head of trade policy at the Commonwealth Secretariat. So what I'm hoping Razak will help us with is, first to understand the importance of these policies to development, and then maybe also to give us the Bangladesh perspective on these issues, and whether these issues have a profile at all in Bangladesh, who we know import to the UK. So Razak, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel. This is an extremely timely and important study. I would like to thank the organizers for doing it and disseminating the findings. And at the outset, I would like to mention that the UK's commitment to helping developing countries with trade-led growth and development is always notable. And in this perspective, I find today's discussion extremely important. Now, I would like to make 3 or 4, I think, key points, to make my arguments about this particular finding. In general, I think what we have seen from the study is this: that initially the impact is not going to be, that great for the countries, particularly the EBA beneficiaries, listed the least developed countries. Which is good. But also, I would like to highlight the fact that despite the widely heard arguments that trade preference doesn't work, I know, there are countries where in many sectors, in particular, trade preferences have actually worked, and from my own country, Bangladesh, it has benefited enormously from the preferences, particularly in the textile and clothing sector. And with regard to Bangladesh, it has done well only in those markets where there have been preferences for textile and clothing. In the European Union, obviously, we have seen Bangladesh's share going up, market share, but also in Australia and Japan that provide duty-free access to least developed countries, and Bangladesh has been a beneficiary. But if you would compare Bangladesh's situation with regard to the United States, where no tariff preferences are given to Bangladesh, you will see that there has not been any significant rise in Bangladesh's market share in clothing items. So in that way, the European Union has always been really, really significant export market. And UK also, after Brexit, is going to be one important market for Bangladesh. Why? Because this is the 3rd largest export market for Bangladesh, and textile and clothing is a prominent export category. Now, in 2019, the total exports from Bangladesh to the UK was about $5 billion US. So that is already a significant market presence that the Bangladeshi exporters have. So that's one issue that we need to think about. Now, I believe, although the paper has found out that initially there is not going to be any major impact, but I believe down the line, the UK will have to think about the other changes, that it will have to bring in, and then to find out, what UK is going to do, whether it is going to have the similar kind of arrangements, that the European Union currently maintaining. One critical example is what to do with the countries that graduate from the group of least developed countries. Bangladesh is going to graduate next year, 2021. It seems so. And if that happens by 2024, Bangladesh should lose all tariff preferences under EBA. Now, under the European Union provision, the European Union allows a graduating LDC to enjoy another 3 year of period, where it can access the market on the same condition. So we need to find out if UK is also going to match that one. So that's one issue. And also, the thing is this, under the European Union rules, it is possible for any graduating LDC to apply for GSP Plus, and especially the preferences on textiles and clothing under EBA and GSP Plus quite comparable, apart from the fact that with the GSP Plus, the provision for rules of origin become much more stringent. One of the things that I would like to highlight is the fact that perhaps UK can make much more improved or bring in much more improved trade policy regime when it comes to thinking about what to do with the graduating LDCs country. On GSP Plus, the European Union provisions for GSP Plus, countries who can qualify or not, I find it quite complicated, and UK should be able to institute a much more simpler version of it. And especially the rules of origin, moving out of LDCs, become onerous, extremely stringent. I think there UK can also make some improvement. On the GSP Plus, the current provision in the European Union is that a country should ratify 27 international conventions, and then there are some mind-boggling import share criteria that, in my view, it is very difficult to understand the rationale for those. UK should go for a much more simplified version of the current EU GSP Plus. So I think that's one point that I would like to highlight. The other issue is, if Bangladesh, under the current EU GSP rules, Bangladesh won't qualify for the GSP Plus provisions. And if that happens, and if UK is going to follow the same EU GSP provisions, then we have got the estimation that suggests that Bangladesh would stand to lose about $500 million worth of exports from the UK market alone. So this is one of the things probably Bangladesh would be looking at with a lot of interest, how the UK is going to reform the trade policy going beyond LDC phase. So that's one issue. Quickly moving on to the other issue that I would like to highlight is the fact that on the tariff preference, advantage for European Union was the single market provisions. And taking advantage of the single market, any importer being located anywhere within Europe could import the bulk from one of the countries and could be able to distribute freely within the European Union without having the restrictions. Now, after Brexit, so developing countries, especially LDCs, they would like to know what kind of arrangements that the UK and EU are going to have, so the cost of trading is not going to increase rapidly for them. My final point at this stage will be that any changes in trade policy, the UK is kind of coming up with, and there are going to be further changes, I believe. I mean, it entails cost for developing countries and LDCs in particular. Now, this is something is known as the trade-related adjustment cost. Now, under the WTO's aid for trade mechanism, there has been the idea, the whole notion is there that the developed countries, they will try to help developing countries and LDCs in particular with regard to trade-related adjustment cost. So this is an area where UK need to think about carefully, what kind of aid or assistance that it can offer to LDCs and other developing countries in adjusting the new trade regime that it is trying to institute. So with those few things, I would like to stop here. Thank you so much. for these opportunities.
Great, thank you, Razak. It's great to have some very practical suggestions for where policy might go next. So that is extremely helpful. Let's move on to Emily Jones, who's the director of the Economic Governance Programme at the University of Oxford, and also has some excellent experience both working in Ghana's Ministry of Trade and Industry, but also in the UK government and Oxfam GB. So, Emily, what I was hoping you could help us with a bit was where the UK government goes next. And we've heard some ideas from Razak, and you and I have had some conversations with policymakers. So what do you see as their next step and the important things to address?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Matteo, and everyone else who wrote the paper, which I really enjoyed reading. And thank you, Razak, for the comments that you've just made as well. So I was pleasantly surprised reading the paper that we're not going to see a huge amount of preference erosion. And so I think that's welcome news. The big question is what we can do to really improve trade with developing countries. And I think that's what we want to focus our discussion on moving forward. Just to briefly say, I think just the paper itself, there's two lessons that it reminded or sort of provoked for me. One was just the value of really careful analysis of the evidence and putting that in the public domain so we all have the information available. So just thank you to the UK TPO for just putting this evidence out there and assuring us that we're not going to have huge problems on preference erosion. A couple of caveats that have already been said with Ghana and Kenya, but I think that's important. And it also just speaks to the work, I think, of the Trade for Development team within DIT, as it does suggest that in planning the global tariff, there was some real careful design that went on to make sure that trade preferences weren't eroded. To acknowledge that work, and it's important, but it's a question now, I think, of building forward and building on from that. And not only safeguarding preferences, but really building out an ambitious, I hope, agenda for trade for development for the UK. Just to flag really quickly, I think there are these immediate areas of concern. I think there are two we just need to think about in this transition period from the EU trade arrangements to our new post-Brexit ones. The first one is really what we do with Ghana, Kenya, and the sort of countries that are reluctant to sign on to rollover agreements. So I think we need to really understand why we haven't seen that happen. And what the politics is there. But very practically, just to remember that the EU had trouble getting its EPAs in place in 2007 and put in a temporary market access regime, which basically it provided unilateral preferences after they'd officially expired in a sort of through a regulation. And I suspect we could do the same and just provide a transition arrangement that allows trade to happen. So it seems to me there's an obvious precedent to use, and that would just allow us to put that to ensure that trade happens while we sort out a longer term arrangement. And to my mind, that's the sort of a fairly low-hanging fruit and just something that UK government should really be acting on now. So it'd be great to hear if that's an option from people on the call. The second one was really to think about whether there are these pinch points in the non-tariff areas. So Razak's mentioned a couple. We are, of course, all moving to a new system of customs arrangements, border controls. I suspect we're all expecting hiccups, whether that's sort of lorries parked in long queues in Dover. But where do developing countries go when they find that they don't know which customs forms to fill in, or they can't practically get their goods into the UK? And I think they're just there. Can we have a sort of one-stop shop perhaps where they can quickly get any hiccups they do face addressed? So just to think about how we practically do that. And I know, again, there's people on the call that have got real experience just looking down the participants list of those supply chains. So it'd be great to think about where exactly there might be pinch points in our immediate transition moment. But then I wanted to then think about, well, what about the big agenda? Where might we go next? How do we move from sort of safeguarding trade, which we've more or less done through transition with developing countries, to actually being a bit bold and imaginative on what we could do? And I'm just going to spin 5 suggestions to the group, and then it'd be really great to have thoughts and feedback. So one is the issues that Razak talked to, which is just some tweaks, I think, to our GSP tariffs to improve the market access. Razak's phrase there of mind-boggling complexity when it comes to rules of origin and graduation criteria. There's some ways of simplifying our GSP scheme that I think would be genuinely useful. And I think the challenge there, or the way to probably do that, is to work with the specific industries. So in garments, to get people in that supply chain to just give us some practical recommendations on what would actually make a difference. So that's the sort of tweaking our existing offer in terms of market access. My second thought was to say, well, yes, it's important to think about the quantity of trade with developing countries, but can we improve the quality of trade? So if we think about who gets what along the supply chain. So I'm thinking there, we all remember the Rana Plaza disaster of a few years ago, and just working conditions for often women in garment factories. So are there practical things we can do to ensure that there are improvements to labour working conditions along the supply chains, that farmers in developing countries get better returns? The traditional approach here, of course, has been to put labour standards in trade agreements. And I was interested to read a new book that I advised sort of everyone on the call to. It's an interesting book to read by James Harrison and colleagues from Warwick on labour standards in EU trade agreements. And what they find there is, as presently designed, they're a pretty ineffective tool. So are there ways in which we can improve labour standards in our existing or the new trade agreements, or the rollover ones as we revise them? But they also suggest, and I thought this is quite an intriguing idea, that governments could do a lot more to improve the role and the responsibility that lead firms take. So our importers, when they're commissioning and importing products along the supply chain, and putting them on the hook, if you like, for improving labour standards. So I think there's probably some innovative things we could do along this labour supply chain. Again, I'd be interested to hear Isaac's thoughts from a garments perspective on that. So are there, again, areas we can work, where government can work with industry to improve supply chains? My third thought was to really think about promoting regional integration and regional value chains within developing countries. A lot of the research that we see coming out is that there are gains, of course, to integrating into global value chains, but the real value add is from regional integration. And of course, we have the African continent looking to really integrate at the moment. The UK government is doing work there, and I think that's really important that we keep prioritising that. And that might mean retrofitting some aspects of the rollover EPAs, for example, on rules of origin, again, where they pose a challenge for regional integration. So not a huge job, but I think being really open to prioritising the support for regional agreements. Fourth one was the WTO. As we all know, it's in a moment of crisis. A rules-based multilateral system is really important for developing countries. So for the UK to be a sort of honest broker, it might be wishful thinking, but let's see. But in that space, to really think about how we restore and create a credible WTO going forward. Fifth area was digital economy. So we've decided it's a priority for the UK. It's a priority area for many developing countries. It's a sort of new game in town, if you like, when it comes to the global economy. New rules are being negotiated globally and in free trade agreements. So first, I think priority is to make sure developing countries have got a seat at that table when it comes to designing the rules for the digital economy and digital trade. And there's some really important discussions and rules that are being negotiated over cross-border data flows and privacy, the regulation of the internet, access to digital technologies, and for big data for public use. Developing countries have got a lot of stake in that. They often come at it at very different angles, but I think the UK could probably support the building up of research and evidence, especially supporting research groups in the Global South, so the kind of policy evidence that decision makers need to both input into those global rulemaking processes, but also develop national and regional policies around the digital economy. So since that's going to be a focus for the UK, it strikes me as an obvious place that we could support developing countries to build out capacity. And then two last points was just to think about our wider economic offer, and to make sure that the UK is really seen as a reliable partner for developing countries on the international stage. Just three issues there that they're not really trade issues, but in a way it's just part of what the type of relationship that we need with developing countries, I think, and where we want to be focused. So debt sustainability, we've seen with COVID a huge amount of concern in developing countries about debt servicing. Quite a lot of that is owed to private creditors and hedge funds, investment funds that are based in London. So as a big financial player, is that a space that we can be a sort of, again, support the restructuring of some of that debt that will need to be restructured? Tax cooperation, so we've seen again a lot of concerns about continued illicit financial flows intermediated by big banks and accounting firms. Again, I think we could play a really constructive role in that space. And the final point was on economic migration. it's mode 4 when it comes to trade, but I think more practically it's our visa regime that actually makes it really hard for business partners from African countries to do business in the UK. With COVID, we're on Zoom at the moment. It's not so much of an issue, but if we're going to have collaborative business relationships between African countries and UK firms, we really do need to get our visa process sorted. And very final point is then to think about the governance of all of this, and just to make sure that we improve consultation with developing countries as we develop our trade policy. So to make sure that we've really got a dialogue with developing countries, and I think to improve the dialogue between the development community in the UK. So we have some excellent research institutions. We have a lot of NGOs and others who've worked for many years on development. And at the moment, there's not that much of an open and frank dialogue with government on this. I'm happy to speak to that more, but I think we could build out, if you look at the trade advisory groups the government set up over the summer, they're all business only. So the development community doesn't really have a voice formally in inputting into UK policy. I think we could look to strengthen that. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Emily. And I think you're right that a certain amount of this is about trade policy, but it's hard not to think about the wider arrangements. So I can see some questions coming in through the Q&A box. So please write something in there if you'd like to ask a question or if you'd like to make a comment. Razak, the first question was for you, actually asking about what it was that, in terms of Bangladesh's access under GSP, which of the 27 conventions isn't one that they've signed up to. I wonder if I could also just get your perspective as well on some of the things that that came up in what Emily was saying. So, and also in what Matthias said. So, one was on one of the suggestions that we modelled in the paper was to look at making GSP more generous at the risk of sort of eroding preferences for EBA countries. Risk not in the sense that it affects them now, but in the sense that it could affect them in future. So, would you like to see a lower tariff? Bangladesh about to graduate, I guess it's in that position where it would benefit from a lower level GSP. So, how do you see the balance between that, GSP access and EBA access?
Thanks. I believe the first question and also the question that you have asked, they are in a way interlinked. So I'd like to answer to them at one go. The first thing is, of the 27 international conventions, Bangladesh has not officially ratified the convention related to the working age of workers. I think there is some kind of lee area there of 17 or 18 years should be considered as a child labor, and that has kind of not helped Bangladesh in kind of ratifying that particular convention. But having said that, even after that, there are other provisions through which Bangladesh's access to GSP Plus will be curtailed. So, for example, under the current rules, if the share of a EBA countries and LDC is more than 6.5% of EU GSP covered imports, then that particular country won't qualify to have GSP Plus. Now, in textile and clothing, Bangladesh's market share is about 17%. So, although the European Union is currently discussing its new or reviewing the next round of GSP regime, that should be coming in place from 2024. I mean, there is a bit of an uncertainty, whether they are going to increase the threshold from, say, 6.5% to more than 17%, whether they can have that kind of jump. So that's one issue. That's number one. And also, for example, even if they allow Bangladesh to have GSP Plus, then there is another provision that is called product graduation criteria. And under that, for the GSP covered imports, no country share can be in textile clothing more than 47%. Now, currently, Bangladesh has got roughly, I think, a share close to that. But more importantly, now the European Union has got an FTA with Vietnam. And when that FTA comes to in operation, then the imports from Vietnam will be excluded in considering the GSP covered imports. And as a result of that, all of a sudden, Bangladesh's share will be increased. So I suspect, if the EU is not going to change its GSP provisions significantly, Bangladesh's textile and clothing exporters, they will end up providing MFN tariffs, even not the standard GSP, that one of the scenarios. So that means all of a sudden, overnight, almost all of Bangladesh's textile export, which is about more than 90% of Bangladesh's total export that goes to European Union, will see a transition from zero tariff to on average 10% tariffs, which is a huge concern. But also, I think the problem with the preference erosion is that maybe in the model we find a smaller impact. The real problem is based on the preferences that are being given. Importers in developed country, in the importing market, they have the incentive, then to go and source from a country that is being given the GSP benefits, so that they don't have to pay import tariffs there. So once that is gone, I believe this particular relationship with the buyer will get lost, as buyers won't find it interesting or lucrative to do a business with a country that has lost preference. But also, like if you think about the global scenario, the relocation of farms taking place from China to other countries, especially Vietnam, and that is going to be quite competitive in the global market. And some of the LDCs will see their preference erosion is being a significant concern. So on the whole, I do think there are significant concerns, but these are also the areas where UK can learn from the current practices in the European Union and can do better. That was my whole argument that I'm trying to make. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Matthew, I don't know if in a minute you might want to come in. I know you've looked at graduation within the product categories, and just to respond to something that Razak's saying on the graduation point and what
it is indeed an issue. I mean,
one thing to add to that, which is, I guess, if you relaxed that, if the UK relaxed that graduation criteria, would that bring in any existing GSP members in terms of their market share?
Now, I would have to do this calculation exactly, but there is this issue in general. I mean, there are countries and sectors which have been graduated in the past and currently face a high tariff, which would be the MFN one, which could be readmitted into the GSP. I guess if the current graduation threshold were to be increased such that we avoid graduations from countries that have a relatively high import share in the UK, especially. Now, in a previous analysis I did on this last year, the issue arose mostly for India, because India is clearly the largest GSP member, and for the UK, it's an even more important trade partner than it is for the rest of the E27. So I can't speak directly to the case of Bangladesh when it comes to import graduation shares, but it is an issue, and I totally understand the concerns of Razak. Also when it comes to application to GSP Plus, which is also another sort of a thorny issue, whether these size criteria would actually be revised in the UK. This is something might affect also Pakistan, for instance, which is also much larger than 6% or 6.5% of the total UK imports under GSP. So there are lots of issues to be looked at. So clearly a simpler GSP structure might actually be the way forward, I think.
Yeah, great. Let me bring Emily back in a moment. I mean, I think there's an interesting tension here. So some of us have written and said, GSP could be simpler, both in terms of its rules and its breadth, and maybe you don't even need a GSP plus and so on. But there's clearly a tension between that and I would say, well, let's use the government's policy outlook. I think the returning Conservative government are much stronger on the promotion of UK values in foreign policy. So there's a nice example. The example of we're signing up to the International Convention that prohibits child labour feels like exactly the kind of thing they want to promote. And then, as Max has said in some of the comments, there's the ambition on climate as well. So maybe, Emily, do you want to come back in on that tension between simplification and promoting values? And I got my own views on the environment and climate, but I'll keep those to myself for now. And then and I know Thomas Burston has also asked a good question, which perhaps you could pick up as well if you've seen it.
Yeah, great. No, thank you, Ian. And just to come on that, well, is it attention? It depends on whose values are being promoted, I think, is what we have to think about. And in the past, I think where these type of conditional access schemes have gone very wrong is where, and I'm thinking the EU's sort of, we want everyone to look like the EU, and here we're going to sort of use our trade policy as a lever to make that happen. That's when you get pushback. Right, so I think it's really about thinking where these are internationally agreed norms and where countries genuinely have an interest, and stakeholders within those countries, in improving the quality of, for example, the labour standards debate. In short, I don't think we need to be seeing this as a sort of the UK putting its values onto developing countries, and the moment we go down that route, we're in trouble. I think what we need to be doing is to think about how do we improve effectively the labour share, the amount of value that accrues to labour right along the value chain. And for developing countries, that's often been seen as an imposition from outside because of the way it's been framed and how it's been done. And what I'm suggesting is a more collaborative way of working, which essentially makes it viable and possible for developing countries to improve the quality of labour without them bearing all those adjustment costs, which is a slightly vague answer, but I think what we need to do is just have a proper dialogue about how do we make it happen. Like, none of us want to see the working conditions. We all want to see improvements. There's got to be a way. But I think there's a proper mature dialogue between the governments from both parties, the businesses along that supply chain, and ultimately the labour unions and labour representatives. So let's have that dialogue. Let's find new ways to foster a proper dialogue. Let's not try and impose it via trade agreements in a sort of top-down way, because that was genuine. That's bound to lead us into problems. Which brings me to, I think, to Thomas's point. Yes, there's a resource issue perhaps, but I actually think it's a politics issue. So his question that he's put in the chat there is to say what resources are needed to make sure we do more on trade for development. And actually there, I think it's about this dialogue. I think genuinely there's an interest in making sure that Global Britain is a success and that we stand for decency on the world stage. And I think the private sector's got a lot to gain from having a responsible approach, whether that's on labour, whether that's on the environment. But we're not seeing that tripartite dialogue happen. At the moment, I am deeply concerned that the trade policy debate has become very much quite insulated within Whitehall. The trade advisory groups have become very insular, and we don't have a proper platform for dialogue. And until we do, we're really not going to see the politics shift and us able to make a sort of a good offer to developing countries. So, and on that note, concerning the Ruth has put in the chat there that the officials said there would be no transition arrangement for Kenya and Ghana, which is just, again, it's concerning. Why is that not politically viable? We've seen the EU do it. Yes, it's technically WTO incompatible, but the reality is we're not going to face a challenge at the WTO, particularly with a dysfunctional WTO dispute settlement mechanism. If it means that we just avoid a catastrophe for suppliers in January, why are we not doing it? So again, I'd love to hear government's perspective on that as to what the impediment and real problem is.
Great, thanks, Emily. Yeah, and thanks, Ruth, for that comment. I mean, I think that Thomas's question speaks to this wider issue that, I think you can see that there's a resource constraint. I mean, both in terms of parliamentary time, but also in terms of officials' time, and therefore in terms of the thinking that would happen. I think you said it at the start, Emily, that it's good that we've done this piece to log the impact. I mean, actually, perhaps 5 years ago, I would have expected the government to have undertaken exactly this sort of impact assessment itself as part of open policy making. But I think the dynamics of government and the challenges of Brexit have made that completely different. So we've just got a couple of minutes left. So let me just go around one more time to our speakers. And I suppose maybe one thing that perhaps Mattia might answer if he comes back on is where are there other questions that we couldn't answer in this? I guess some people have raised we talked, didn't we, about the sort of wider costs, the admin costs, the trade costs that Razak mentioned. What's on your wish list, or what's your takeaway on the analytical or research side? Then I'll come to Razak and maybe I think we had a lot of good ideas, Razak. Maybe if you had one plea for the government to hear, what would it be? And then we'll finish up with Emily conclude on time. So, Mattia, final comments, please.
Right. So I think in the very short run, the obvious thing that the government could do is what we looked at, trying to make preferences larger and avoiding preference erosion for EBA countries is kind of the obvious place to go. Although in the future, I think the GSP scheme should be simplified and having less tiers, less graduation rules, possibly focus on LDCs only, and without conditionality, which doesn't work anyway, as we have seen or has been applied in a sort of non-consistent way, depending on on commercial interests too of the EU. I don't want to go into that now, but overall, I guess that a sort of more streamlined, simplified GSP scheme focus on LDCs will be the way to go for the future, and then engaging to bilateral talks with the other sort of relatively larger developing countries.
Great, thank you, Razak.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the point about having a simplified GSP regime, I think, has been made quite strongly. But the final thing about making a play to the government, like the UK government, my point will be, sometimes we are going to come up with these numbers, how the tariff regime is going to affect a country, like in terms of export losses or other quantitative measures. I would urge the UK government to go beyond these numbers, because there are certain sensitive sectors and there are issues that cannot be captured through the numbers. So for me, if a country like Bangladesh is going to lose its exports of garments, it's the women workers, they are going to be most affected. And that has got a huge implications, on the development issues in particular. UK has been known as a powerful force for development, and I believe some of these issues can be addressed as the UK is going to come up with the new policy arrangements. And final thing is, as Emily has pointed out, I would really like to say UK to help and work with other developing countries in strengthening the multilateral trading system. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Razak. The emphasis, I think, on collaborative working is an inclusive discussion about what next is an important one. Emily.
Thank you. So very briefly from me, one thing I wanted to flag to everybody is that a positive note this week was we saw the creation of a new APPG, so a new all-party parliamentary group on trade and export promotion, which is attempting to be this inclusive platform that we desperately need. So it's set up, it's got people from the House of Lords and the House of Commons who are the officers for it from all different parties. It is genuinely an attempt to to enable Parliament to hear from all different stakeholders, and hopefully will be a platform for dialogue with government. So just if you aren't following that already, please do. And they will have open calls. They're going to call for evidence. They're trying to figure out their work plan at the moment. So I think making sure that development is one of the areas they look at would be great. Simon just put a point there about just our offer, the UK's offer to China. Just to say there, Simon, I think the issue is that we don't quite know what the UK's offer is going to be. So we've kind of inherited the EU's offer, and it's exactly that we're trying to discuss. But I think at the moment, two things. One is that the trade flows between developing countries and China tend to be more natural resource based and primary. So the trade with the UK in some areas is more value add, which of course is important, but it's growing much slower than trade with China. So China's a big game in town for trade for a lot of developing countries, and it's a big investor and supporter of a source of finance, and it's more pragmatic in its dealings than the EU has traditionally been. So for a lot of countries, it's a welcome player on the scene. Let's see how the debt restructuring plays out, and whether a lot of debt is owed to China. And I think that's going to be a place where we see to what extent we can have collaborative frameworks for debt restructuring between China and developing countries. Those are just my two thoughts.
Right, thanks, Emily. And you might see in the Q&A box, Peter Reid, who's from DRT, has responded to some of the points, and one in particular being the 3-year period will continue under UK policy. And I mean, I think when we talk to officials, you see this commitment to improve access is real, and that the government will come to it. I guess the APPG maybe is one way to help to hold government to account on that. And perhaps ministers will reiterate that commitment. So I think it's an interesting time, and I think we need to keep working on this agenda. So thank you very much to our panelists and to our co-authors on the report, and to Sussex for hosting this discussion. I hope it's been useful, and please reach out to us afterwards if you'd like to follow up and have further discussion. But our time is up, and have a good afternoon.